people really want to see stories that really take them someplace. And so one of the things that I really love is like those tricks you can use to make a book that would maybe come across as otherwise too quiet into something that can be described as like really page turning without sort of like having, you know, super high stakes or like ridiculously unrealistic plot lines, because I still really like slice of life stories. And I think that there are ways to make those stories really exciting and really vibrant. And so I love high concept, but I don't think that it has to be something that's like, you know, set on Mars to be an enjoyable, immersive read. So one of my tricks for that is to always encourage people to be focusing on active versus passive voice in their writing, and to be really, really aware of these like little ways you can trick your readers, like even on just like a line level or a word level, into, you know, being really, really impacted by what you're writing. So when I'm talking about active, oops, I skipped a slide. Here we go. So when we're talking about active versus passive voice, what we're really talking about is the subject of your sentence. So it's a grammatical feature, obviously, but when we talk about active voice, what we're really talking about is focusing on the character and focusing on what they're doing and on their power and on their agency. And so even though it might seem like a little tedious kind of grammar trick more than anything, I think that the more that we lean into that active voice in writing, the more that we get to see our characters really getting to act out their own stories. And that becomes really, really powerful for the reader. So active voice is the voice that's usually used in fiction. Passive voice is often used in like academic writing or some nonfiction writing. We use it a lot because it's really clean, it's simple, it's direct. And like I said, it gives the subject of the sentence power and agency because they're performing the action in the sentence. So the more that we can like read our own writing with that in mind, the more that we bring those characters into their own, I think. Versus the passive voice, which, like I said, is often used in nonfiction, in some science writing, for example. For those of you who like that's your quirky query letter hobby, you're probably very familiar with that voice. It emphasizes the action rather than the subject, and so it can be really useful sometimes, and I'm going to talk about the ways it can be useful too. But for example, it can be more tactful, or it can be a little bit more subtle, and it can create an illusion of sort of objectivity or authority. And so I find it most useful in dialogue. So when I'm trying to create character really, really quickly in dialogue, if you can use the passive voice, either to create a character that, you know, like a security guard, for example, if he's speaking in a passive voice, you'll get the sense right away that he feels like he's the boss. Or on the other hand, if you have sort of someone who's a little bit more submissive, then you'll see them being a little more tactful. Those are cases in which the passive voice might be used. So why do we use active voice other than to trick our readers, which, you know, is very like, maybe that's a very like mischievous way to want to use grammar, but here we are. It is more clear, and it tends to be more accessible as well. So especially if you're writing for, I always say, like the grocery store reader who wants to be able to like pick up a book and just enjoy it and not have to think. We've all been there. That's going to make your writing really clear and really accessible. I always say that that's the kind of book that like my mom loves to read, because she does not want to feel challenged when she is picking up a book. She wants to be able to just like chill in her armchair. So when you're trying to write for that audience, especially, active voice is a great way to do that. It also can really, really help with your word count. So you'll notice that if you're writing in passive voice a lot, you're going to get sort of like longer, wordier sentences. And sometimes that can be like an effective stylistic, you know, strategy to use. But if you're trying to be really precise and efficient, or if, for example, you're reading my manuscript wish list and you're like 100,000 words, what do you mean you don't consider things over 1,000 words? Just something I get all the time. That's one way that you can really pare down the word counts in your query letters and in your writing overall. It also, like I said, grants agency and power to your subject. It can also, because of that, create more emotional impact. So if somebody is really on board and your character is doing like a big thing, then it's probably going to have more impact than if it's described in kind of like a roundabout way. It can also come across as being more descriptive and kind of less robotic. People are used to reading a lot of passive voice in things like instruction manuals, or like even blog posts and things that are like about a product maybe, because it does make things sound like they're coming from this like objective scientific. When we use active voice, we get the opposite of that. It sounds very human. It sounds very like lush in a lot of ways. So when we're thinking about how to compete with the AI books, this is the way to do it, is to be the master of your active voice. So these are just a few little tricks to convert passive voice to active voice. So obviously, I mean, this could be like an hour-long grammar lesson, and I don't want it to be that. But these are just like a few little easy ways that when you're reading, if you're not like 100% on your grammar and you're like, is this active voice? Is this passive voice? Sometimes you can use these little tricks to kind of figure out, is this something that I should be changing from passive to active? So for example, you can look for a by phrase. So if your sentence has the word by in it, often that's a giveaway. So like, the documents were edited by Mike. Mike is the subject of that sentence, but he's not an active subject in that case. So it's a really easy way to be like, oh, this is a sentence I can change around. I can make Mike the active subject. The other one is if there is an action, but if there is no name of a subject or no subject is identified, then that's a really easy way to be like, oh, this is in passive voice. I need to like stick a subject in there somehow. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the character's name, but it'll identify who is performing the action. And then the other one is to look for two different verbs. So if your sentence has a form of the verb to be in it, and then also your main verb, then that's also a good hint that you're probably in passive voice. So these are just examples of the little tips that I've just outlined. So when you see the sentence, the exam was failed by most students, you can see the little by in there and you can be like, oh, that's my red flag, that's my passive voice. So the way that we would switch this to the active voice is to say most students failed the exam. The other thing is, if you have a sentence where there isn't the word by, but you can add it to that sentence and still have it be grammatically correct, that's another like little way to test. So if you had like, the policy was changed, that doesn't have the word by in it, but obviously it's a short sentence, and you could add, if you're wondering to yourself, does this have an anonymous subject in it? If you can add by and a name to it and still have it be a proper sentence, then that's like the same little flag. So that comes up in the next one, which is the anonymous subject. Visitors are not allowed. So visitors are not allowed doesn't have a subject in it at all, but you could always say visitors are not allowed by the principal or by the office. So if there's an anonymous subject, or you could add the by in and still have it be like, it's a little awkward, but it's still correct, then that's a good hint that you're in passive voice. And then the last one is having the two verbs. So the check was paid by my friends. You can see the verb to be, and you can also see the verb paid, which is your main verb. So you can see those two verbs in there right beside each other. That's a giveaway that this is passive voice. So if you wanted to switch it to active voice, it would say my friends paid the check, and then you've given them a little more credit for the action that they've done here, maybe a little bit of extra thanks in this scenario, and you've changed to active voice. So there are a couple of situations in which you could use passive voice and it would still be really effective. One is when you want to emphasize an action rather than the actor. So for example, we have here, the woman was sentenced to 5 years in jail. This emphasizes that, that she was given this prison sentence, and it takes the action off of the judge, I guess in this case. The active version might be the judge sentenced the woman to 5 years in jail. But what we want to focus on here is the woman and her predicament, right? And not the person who made that decision. So in this case, the woman would probably be your character, and you would be describing her situation rather than describing the person who made that choice. And then the other example that I have is if we're trying to be sneaky and we're trying to avoid naming the subject of the action. So the rules were somehow misinterpreted by who we don't know. Was it your character? Was it someone else? Are you trying to like make a hint at something without outright telling your readers or outright lying to them? The passive voice can be a tricky way to do that too. So there are some instances in which passive voice can be really, really helpful. So that is my whole cutesy slideshow about active versus passive voice. I did give these slides to Jessica as a PDF, so if anybody wants them, I'm sure that they can be made available. And I know that it's not the most thorough lesson, but hopefully it gives like a little bit of an idea of how you can use like a nerdy grammar trick to trick your readers and possible agents and editors into feeling like your story is really, really immersive and really exciting, even in its quieter moments. So I hope that's helpful to everyone.